Our events, research projects, and collaborations embrace themes such as comparative studies, literary historiography, intermediality, digital humanities, amongst others. This group endeavors to create a sustainable and socially relevant hub. Our primary intention is to engage with and enhance the tools, methodology, theory, and approaches pertaining to these dynamically interactive areas of study. Thank you very much. Over to you, Shrimoyee.
Thank you, Nilza, for introducing this in such a beautiful manner. So now I'm going to talk about diaspora and memory studies. As Nilza rightly pointed out, there are several subgroups. So the lectures that we are trying to organize under diaspora and memory studies focus mainly on migration, the diasporic experiences of the immigrants, and the impact of trauma and how memory and forgetting are significant in the diasporic journey. So we are trying to organize this lecture to ensure a dialogue between various disciplines. We are engaging scholars who are grounded in multiple focused areas. And today's seminar is also conceptualized in the same line. We sincerely hope that the discussion following the talk is going to enrich and enhance the way comparative studies function today. And now I'm going to introduce our speaker, Professor Astrid. Astrid Erll is a professor of Anglophone literatures and cultures at Goethe University, Frankfurt. She has worked on German, British, South Asian, American, and South African literatures and media cultures. Her research interests include literary history, focusing on 19th to 21st century, media history, focus on film and photography, English and comparative literature, cultural theory, media theory, narratology, transcultural studies, and last but not the least, memory studies. Astrid is general editor of the book series Media and Cultural Memory and co-editor of a companion to Cultural Memory Studies and Mediation, Remediation, and the Dynamics of Cultural Memory. More recently, she has published with Anne Rigney, Audiovisual Memory and the Remaking of Europe, and Cultural Memory After the Transnational Turn. She is author of Memory in Culture, an Introduction to Memory Studies, which was originally published in German as Kollektives Gedächtnis und Erinnerungskulturen, and has also been translated into Chinese, Spanish, and Polish. In 2011, Astrid founded the Frankfurt Memory Studies platform, a vibrant forum for memory studies across the disciplines, connecting researchers both in Frankfurt and internationally. In 2016, she received a research grant from the Volkswagen Stiftung for an opus magnum on the reception of Homer as cultural memory, Odyssean Travels, a literary history of cultural memory. Astrid, the virtual platform is all yours now. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation to your group and also for the kind introduction. When Shri wrote to me, I said I cannot come up with something extremely new now, but I would like to discuss something that I came up with a year ago, and that was an article about the coronavirus pandemic. And what struck me when the pandemic struck is how easy it was for me to think through the pandemic with the tools that I had acquired over the past 2 decades in the field of collective memory. And I've written that article, which you have also read or not read, which tries to figure out how collective memory played a role before the pandemic, during the pandemic, and after the pandemic. Now, as I am from Germany, and in particular for the past 1.5 years have just been sitting really in Germany and haven't left the country, of course my perspective is extremely biased. It's based on what I experience here and what I read and see in the news. Perhaps it's an European perspective, but I'm pretty sure that some things must be different from Asian and in particular Indian perspectives. So that's something that I would like to talk about with you. And I'll quickly present what the article was about, how it kind of classified different types of memory and how they are connected with the coronavirus pandemic. I'll add what has come to my thinking over the past year as the pandemic dragged on. And then I would be really grateful if we could open up in a discussion and if I could hear what you have to say about the South Asian experience of COVID-19. So I'll start by sharing my screen, if that's possible, and show you my PowerPoint. Here it is. So, and you should be able to see this, no? Yeah. All right. And what I call this now, and this is basically the end of my talk, relational memory. I think this is something where we need to go in our practices of commemoration, relational memory in the world risk society. Okay. Before I start, let me quickly say where I come from or from what position I speak. I am a literary historian. My training is in German and English literature, basically. I've written my PhD thesis on novels about the First World War. And interestingly, incidentally, I've written my second PhD thesis, because you need two in Germany, on the Indian Revolt of 1857 and how that was remembered in different Indian literatures and media cultures, but also in Britain and across the world. So this is where I come from, literary and cultural studies. But whenever I say I work in memory studies, what I really mean is a vastly multidisciplinary field, which stretches all the way from the neurosciences to psychology, to cognitive sciences, to sociology, very important, history, of course, anthropology. You see the entire circle. And this is just a little bit of what memory studies really is. Many disciplines are not there. Many key concepts are not listed. So that's what it is, as far as I'm concerned, a multidisciplinary platform where I come in with my, well, I more and more realize with my specific methods. I think the interdisciplinarity of memory studies really needs to talk about methods. So it will be the methods of a literary historian and a cultural analysis analyst that I have on display. All right, the coronavirus pandemic. My very simple, you may call it Teutonic setup is, I would like to look at memory before Corona, memory during Corona, and memory after Corona. When it comes to memory before Corona, before the virus struck, and when it comes in, and this is an important qualifier now, when it comes to Europe, then we can really talk about something like, metaphorically, forgetting pandemics. People were not aware of the danger that pandemics could pose, and people were not used to behaving properly in a pandemic. So what I argue in my article is that as far as Europe is concerned, what we did here was, when it comes to pandemics, we kind of relegated them either to the pre-modern self. So pandemics, that's the plague in the Middle Ages, that's an earlier form of us. Or we put it to the cultural and geographical other. So epidemics is something that would happen, for example, in the African jungle. And that's what you also see in media culture, for example, in films like Outbreak, which you see here on the right-hand side. And this is curious in a sense, because if you look at the 20th century, that has, of course, been a pandemic century. All the way from, and I come to that, the Spanish flu, and here you see just the major epidemics since the Second World War, or since the mid-century, which also impacted on Europe, but never so much that people kept it in their collective memory. And the elephant in the room really is the Spanish influenza pandemic, which was really a global event which affected also many people in Europe and the United States. And if you do your reckoning, you realize, and I'm heavily indebted here to Laura Spinney's fantastic global history of the Spanish influenza pandemic. If you do your reckoning, if you do the numbers, then you realize that the Spanish flu cost more lives than the First World War, more lives than the Second World War, and possibly more than the two taken together. And so thinking in sheer numbers of the dead, it's really amazing that there is virtually no collective memory of that in Europe today. So if we want to formulate this with the theory of history as it was created by Reinhard Koselleck, the German historian, we could speak about the space of experience. So whatever a collectivity has experienced and thinks is important, that's the space of experience. And from there, something emerges that Koselleck calls the horizon of expectation. So what can we expect? That will be based on what we have already experienced, on that repertoire, on that reservoir. So if the space of experience looks like this in Europe, and extremely important for commemorative culture is the Second World War. With the centenary, the First World War also got more and more important. In Great Britain, it had been important all along. In Germany, not at all. So of course there are differences. But our space of experience looked in early 2020 a bit like this. Very big elephants in the room are the First and the Second World War, the Holocaust, of course, probably global terrorism, 9/11, such things. But the Spanish flu should even be written smaller than you see it in my slide here. Not remembered, no public awareness, I would say, of that pandemic. So, and what kind of horizon of expectation does derive from that? No? If you remember the wars, but you don't remember health crisis. And if you take an international perspective, then you see, if you compare this with East Asian societies, that like Japan and China, they have kept their habits of using face masks. And to me, it seems that this habit goes back to the experience of the Spanish influenza. So they have kept the memory, they have kept the habit, and we did the same in Europe, but we've completely forgotten it, and the habit has disappeared. And then we had a really strange situation that in Europe, when in spring 2020, politicians were saying you should wear face masks, people didn't understand that. I didn't understand it. I found it really strange. And to be quite honest, I never knew why Chinese tourists in Frankfurt wear face masks. There was no knowledge about the use of that item in Europe, I would say. So here you see Japanese schoolgirls in 1920 wearing face masks. On the right-hand side, you see something extremely new, and that would be gondoliere in Venice wearing face masks in 2020. So this is and I will come back to this. This is a type of collective memory that we could call perhaps habit memory with Paul Connaughton. There are other types of collective memory. But before I come to that, let me quickly say that I call this this process of pre-forming of experience through collective memory, I call that pre-mediation. And it's not a simple or a nice term, but I use it because for me, all memory is mediated memory. All collective memory is mediated memory. You don't have collective memory if you don't have some kind of mediation. And that mediation can be very primary, gesture, orality. More often it's books and it's the internet. If you want to share experience, if you want to share an image of the past, you need to mediate it. Only then it gets collective. And because all memory is mediated, all anticipation is a matter of pre-mediation, okay? So pre-mediation is based on past mediations and remediations. To complicate it further, I've put into the footnotes here my book with Anne Rigney, on remediation and the dynamics of cultural memory. So pandemics were no matter of pre-mediation in Europe. There was little that we knew, little that we read, little photographs or documentary footage that would have stuck in our mind of earlier pandemics. And why wasn't that the case? Because there were so many dead also across Europe. And in that article, and I do not want to go into this very deeply now, I come up with a list of of processes that need to be in place for an event to become memorable for a social group. One has to do with the historical event itself. It must be discrete. So you must be able to perceive it as an event in itself. And with the Spanish flu, that was a bit difficult for historical reasons. It was so fast. It killed people often in just 2 days. People at that time had many other illnesses, many other epidemics also rampant across Europe, and they would die of that. So it was sometimes difficult for people to say, did he die of this or did he die of something else? Then the virus, of course, was not visible, you couldn't see it. You couldn't diagnose it because for that you need the electron microscopes. So difficult to understand what was really going on here, to put your finger on it. And then come all the aspects of memory culture that I think we can grasp particularly well as literary historians. Narrativity, is it an event that is that you can easily narrate, put into a story with a beginning, a middle part, and an end, and probably also with a moral to the story? That's the one thing. I think that's difficult with pandemics. It's much easier with wars, also where you have the normative message of who are the victims, who are the perpetrators, who are the winners, who are the losers, what is the clear beginning, what is the clear ending. You can do that with a war. It's very difficult with pandemics. Connected to that, tellability, which is a narratology term for noteworthiness. So tellability, stories that have a point are tellable stories. If you tell somebody, I woke up this morning and had a cup of tea, that's not a tellable story. But if you tell somebody, I woke up this morning and had a cup of tea, and then I looked out of the window and the Twin Towers were falling, that's a tellable story. That tells you that you were a witness of 9/11. I talked about normativity, so the good, the bad, the victims, the perpetrators, difficult, because we have, in a strict sense, I come back to that, no human perpetrators here. So if you think anthropocentrically alone, then it's difficult to narrate pandemics. And then important for the Spanish flu, archives. And because there are no really impactful novels or theater plays or movies or even paintings left of the Spanish influenza pandemic, I put on the slide 2, one by Egon Schiele, one by Edgar Munch, both very famous modernist painters. But these paintings that address the flu are not their most important paintings. We probably hadn't seen them before, or not before the coronavirus pandemic struck. So the question is there an archive on which following generations can draw again and again? And I'm thinking here with a distinction that historians make, and that in the German language they would call tradition and trace. So tradition would be all those sources that are consciously created so that later generations can use them, look back at this. So a monument would be tradition, but also a book that details how I lived through the coronavirus pandemic, that would be tradition. That we do not have really, or not too much when it comes to the Spanish influenza pandemic. We do have traces. So all the things that are just left in terms of medical records or even DNA traces that are now being excavated and looked at again. So this is why the Spanish flu of 100 years ago hasn't really been put into a coherent narrative that would have been easy to remember for collectivities. And the effect of that is no pandemic-related premediation in early 2020. But of course, there is a but. I have learned in collaborating with Guy Biner, whom I quote in a minute. It's not here. Here, it's the first here. Pandemic Reawakenings. That's a book, a big edited book about the Spanish flu that will come out later this year, where people from around the world, historians mainly, write about different experiences of the Spanish flu. And there I learned that it was retained in family memory. So across the world, you can talk to families and some of them will remember that the grand uncle or whatever was killed in or died of the Spanish influenza. So there is something of a retention in family memory, but not in other frames of memory. No? Family memory yet, but it doesn't translate into public memory, it doesn't translate into national memory. So always difficult to say when is something forgotten. I think nothing is ever really forgotten. The question is, in what frames is memory active? And the Spanish flu wasn't active in the public frames, in the national frames, in the artistic frames, but it was active in the family frame, and it was certainly active in scientific frameworks. So for virologists, the Spanish influenza or the H1N1 virus is something even like a foundational memory. And they went at great pains, at great lengths to studying it, even reconstructing it genetically at one point. So that is what I wanted to say about memory before Corona. And this is something that I would really like to discuss with you, what the situation was in India in early 2020. How long did it take so that people realized that this is an event in its own, and what is the shape of the event, and what kind of cultural resources could they bring to the event? What kind of earlier experience had been similar? What kind of earlier strategies could be applied or not applied? Okay, second part, and that will be quicker now, is about memory during the coronavirus pandemic. And my keywords here are triggered, used, and abused. And there's now a whole list of different aspects that I observed. I observed, first of all, let's say in the first half year, a groping for historical analogies. So people really started, at least where I live, to get interested in earlier pandemics. And suddenly the books about the medieval plague and Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year and many other related books, they almost sold out. So people were interested in earlier pandemics. And the ironical twist is that I first argued that the flu was forgotten, and now 1 year later, I can say the flu is remembered. Even if I go to my dentist, she recommends to me the book by Laura Spinney about the Spanish flu. So people have read up on that. And I think this groping for historical analogies, has humanity been through something similar before, and trying to understand, drawing parallels. That was important for the first months. And for my feeling, it's now over. I think we have fully arrived in the coronavirus pandemic as a discrete event on its own. And we know its specificities. We have a sense of what our experience is with this pandemic. When we come to the political stage, the first, almost a knee-jerk reaction almost something that is habit memory, is comparisons with the Second World War. And that would be something like the usual suspect of European and North American memory cultures, of course. So Boris Johnson invokes the Second World War. Trump speaks about Pearl Harbor, which of course implies that evil Asians have made an attack on the United States. So you see, in the way that the Second World War was drawn on, was remembered, you see also a renationalization of memory in the first phase. There's an interesting way in which the Queen reactualizes or mobilizes memories of the Second World War, because for her, it's her own lifetime. She's a witness to that history, and she remembers herself within a more private frame and about more private family matters. That's interesting, I think, as an example of how royal memory works. But I'll pass over that. I'd like to remind you of Macron, who in his presidential speech said, I think 6 times, "Nous sommes en guerre." We are at war now. We are at war. We are at war. He is careful to say that we are not fighting against a different nation. So making clear this is not about national war memory, but he uses the war metaphor. And I think the question is here, what is the logic of the war metaphor, which was so important in the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic? And here too, I'm interested to hear what metaphors people in India would have drawn on. When we talk about the war metaphor, and here in Israel, Netanyahu uses it as well. In particular, he's getting the landing on the Normandy. So that's Second World War analogies, metaphors. Again, if we want to talk about the logic of the war metaphor, we can go back to Susan Sontag's essays on illness as metaphor, and in particular here AIDS and its metaphors, where she says, war making is one of the few activities that people are not supposed to view realistically. That is, with an eye to expense and practical outcome, an emergency in which no sacrifice is excessive. And I think that's what it is. And I think I say this neutrally. If you use the war metaphor, then you want to say this now no sacrifice is too excessive. You make that point. I'm not sure I agree with how Susan Sontag goes on arguing that you immediately blame those who are ill in this process of war metaphors, but that we could discuss afterwards. I quickly go over this when we come to the question of what memories were triggered by the coronavirus pandemic. And if I looked around news outlets across the world in spring 2020, and I found that indigenous communities sometimes remembered how Europeans came to their lands and brought with them their viruses to which these populations hadn't been habituated at all. So, and they, sometimes almost died out because of that. So in Germany, we had a discussion of, for us, the Robert Koch Institute is very important. They are the ones who organize all the knowledge about the virus and disseminate it to the public. And Robert Koch in the 19th century has a positive history of bringing knowledge about epidemics and bacteria, and has a negative history of using people from Africa in his experiments. So that was, again, histories of colonialism and racism were discussed in the wake of that beginning of the coronavirus pandemic. What is quite striking, and I think here we can talk about across the world, is how stereotypes and negative stereotyping came up in the wake of the pandemic. Racial stereotypes, and I call them now habits of thought or bad habits of thought, because I think that many of these are unthought. I think they belong to something like the non-conscious repertoire of collectivities. It's a collective memory, but it's not something that you need to find in your mind and then draw on and treat explicitly. But again, that's something like a knee-jerk reaction for many, not for all. Some people can use and abuse this explicitly, of course. So incidents with racial stereotypes were so quickly happening across the world that Wikipedia set up this page, the list of incidents of xenophobia and racism that were related to COVID-19. And there are examples from all over the world. This is one example that I found with a view to India. A measure of fighting thinking in stereotypes. And these stereotypes in the first step, of course, were often connected with people who looked East Asian, so seemingly Chinese-like, seemingly carrying the virus just because they look in a particular way. But if you look at the list, you find all kind of mad stereotyping that has nothing to do even remotely with Corona any longer. I'll move on now from something that is triggered as a habit of thinking in a crisis situation to now ways that evolved then over the first year of trying to archive and then also trying to commemorate the coronavirus pandemic. So already in the first months, people realized that this is a particular situation. This is an event of global proportions, and they started to create archives. So in Germany, the most famous one is the Corona-Archiv, which you see here. But when they made an online event, they showed us this map, which again shows where people had, and I think this was in summer 2020, where people had archival initiatives set up. So quite something really. And so far I see one in India here. Perhaps we can talk about whether there's more. These are some examples of archives that try to keep coronavirus experience. So people should send in their own photographs or their own little stories of what they experienced. And sometimes these archives are very broad, anybody can submit. And sometimes these archives want to see what is the specific experience in the, I don't know, southern part of New York or whatever. Archiving is one kind of conscious memory making within the coronavirus pandemic. The other mode would be commemoration. And I think it's no surprise that this is something that came up after or with the first anniversary, spring 2021. After 1 year, and that's just a matter of cultural ways of commemorating. After 1 year has passed with something terrible, you start to mark time and you start to commemorate, you start to count the dead and to address the dead. This is exactly what happened in Germany in the very modes that we have been used to, I don't know, for the past centuries, you could even say. So this is our president, Walter Steinmeier, who is having the commemorative event or a commemorative ceremony for the dead during the coronavirus pandemic. And you see here, he's of course dressed in black, the color of mourning. There are of course flowers. There are of course candles. And you see in the back, there is the German flag. So it's a national framing. He commemorates the German dead, but there's also a more European framing with the European flag. So this would be when it comes to anniversary commemoration and when it comes to politicians, state presidents, then what we've seen also in Italy, also in Great Britain, traditional languages of mourning and of commemoration. But of course, there are other acts of commemoration. And while I called Steinmeier's initiative top-down, these would be bottom-up or grassroots commemorative investments, or you could even call something like this memory activism. Now, you know, the National COVID Memorial Wall, which started with memory activists painting these hearts for all the Corona dead at a wall in London across the Thames. And there's a lot of memory commemoration initiatives on the internet, of course, as well. Okay, so that's for me the collective memory scene during the coronavirus pandemic. And the next is, of course, extreme and pure conjecture. What will happen afterwards? How will we remember COVID-19? Some people, some colleagues tended to say nobody will remember it. In 50 years, it will be gone from collective memories, because health crises are usually not remembered very well. And of course, you've seen what I had to say about the Spanish flu. That's of course also true. So what will stick in collective memory? With whom? For how long? Hang on. Yeah. What I've just showed you, the commemorative ceremonies and the memorials, these are instances of the making of collective memory, instances of commemorative investment. There are also other dynamics, and a second one I would like to call the emergence of collective memory. What sometimes emerges is a generational memory that is based on typical generational experience. And this generational memory has been theorized first, to my knowledge, by the sociologist Karl Mannheim. And he came up with the notion, or others came up with that before, but he really theorized it, of the formative period. And nowadays it's a bit debated. I would say the formative period is from 17 to 24, when you are young and when you are at an impressionable age. So research in sociology has shown that the experience you make at that age will shape also your political attitudes very much. And research from cognitive psychology has shown that there's something like a reminiscence bump in autobiographical memories. And that means that across the lifespan, so if you ask people who are 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, and so on, they tend to remember best the events that happened when they were in their formative period, when they were young. And what does that mean for the coronavirus pandemic? If we consider that, at least in Europe, it is the young people who were affected most in their daily lives, really. They did not go to school, they did not go to university, they did not do what is very important from a developmental perspective, and that is hanging out together and all these things that you do when you are young. So this is something that we will see, whether for that generation, the coronavirus pandemic might remain as something, as a shared memory, probably also as a generation defining memory. But then the process of collective memory, as Jan and Aleida Assmann have delineated it, who distinguish between communicative and cultural memory. With that generation, the memory of Corona might die out if we do not find ways of mediating it in ways so that it travels across the generational threshold. So only if that generation finds Corona important enough to write books about it, to tell their offspring about it, to make films about it, only then does the memory have a chance of entering into cultural memory, and that means being also remembered by later generations. Then there is, of course, the question of the afterlives of all these archives. No? Will they go on working? Will they publish books from their archival materials? Will they make exhibitions in museums? What will happen to all the data that are now collected with a view to COVID-19? I mean, this is really a global event the first real global event that in the age of the Web 2.0, in the age of new media and social media in particular. And we'll have to see what will come of that. There may be effects of all the stereotyping that is happening right now, the naming, like when Trump said it's the Chinese virus, when the Chinese said it's the American virus. There may be effects, memorable effects of all this conspiracy myths that are traveling around right now, circulating. There are quite a few of them in Germany, and I would like to hear how the situation is in India. So is that what will stick in people's memories, these false myths about the origins of the virus, and also of many false myths here in Germany about the vaccinations and so on? So how will that play out in the future? And in the end of the day, that's again, and I come back now to the Spanish flu, it's a question of good narratives. It's a question of good stories. What can you narrativize? What is an easy story? Also an interesting story to tell. Is it the conspiracist's myth? Or is it a highly complex story about how a virus came into the world and then affected the entire globe in vastly different ways? And in this slide, I come back to this question of narrativization, which Hayden White calls explanation by implotment. So for each event, we need to answer this question, beginning, middle, ending. And there are narrative possibilities of the coronavirus pandemic. Fritz Breithaupt has written about them, and Avishek Parui and Marin Raj will publish a paper on that in the journal Memory Studies, will come out in a few months' time. So there are narrative possibilities. How do we want to narrate the pandemic? Attacked by others, or a bad spell and then we go back to normal? Or was it the rise of total control? Everybody had to wear face masks. Or was it a time where collective action was strengthened? Think of the Wall of Hearts and probably other instances of collective mobilization. Is it a cultural trauma? That would be a ready template for memory studies. Is it a tragedy? Is it a reason for outrage? So how will the coronavirus pandemic be narrativized? From what I've spoken so far, you realize that when I talk about a collective memory, this is not one thing, but it is ways of remembering the past, looking at the present and imagining something for the future that play out in very different social frames. So this list shows you corona memory will be part of individual life experience. So psychologists would call that it will be part of our autobiographical memory. There's family memory. There's of course the kind of memory that you develop when you have dead in your family. It is commemorative memory. It will probably be generational memory. And then there will be aspects that are not explicit memories, but rather legacies. There will be legacies of the pandemic that we probably will not in 50 years connect with the pandemic, but which may still be playing out: financial, ecological legacies, educational, digital legacies. There may be effects on social habit memory, how we interact, that has been shaped by Corona. The fact that I'm speaking here is a case in point. Scientific knowledge and the way it's passed on is for me a type of collective memory as well, and so on and so forth. And the question I'm asking is whether after the pandemic there may be new modes of collective remembering. And the reason I'm asking that is exactly the reason I've been talking about at length, because pandemics are so difficult to remember, and to remember properly. And properly means for me, remember it so that it has something to do with the historical facts. We do have problems for traditional commemorative memory, something that has been come to be called modern memory, at least in Europe. So modern memory in Europe, let's say since around 1800, needs a normative lesson. Are there victims? Are there perpetrators? Difficult to say. In the end, it's genetic accident. Then very difficult for commemorative memory also. The pandemics have a human, non-human dynamics. It's an interaction between viruses and humans and also animals and so forth. And that's difficult for memory because of the anthropocentrism of at least European memory cultures. We tend to remember what people they do. No? We used to remember what great men did. This has been a bit modified, but it's still the people, the humans that are in the limelight. And then this difficulty of having a global event, which is not even, but utterly uneven. So the social dimension of the pandemic has played out so diversely, even within a small country like Germany, very diverse, very uneven, the local differences, the differences according to class, according to age, according to occupation. And then if you look at the more global dimension, that's of course very uneven, and at the same time, all in the same boat, all affected by the same virus. So for me, this is really a case where the World Risk Society shows. And what we're having now is a World Risk Society in a post-human age. In the age where we've started to discuss the Anthropocene and what that means for our conception of the relation between humans, geology, biology, and so forth. And I think that in order to remember such a complex constellation that impacted everyone's life, to remember that properly somehow, we need to develop something that I call relational remembering. Why are pandemics relational occurrences? First of all, there is the relationality between humans, animals, and microbes that we need to take into account. And then that relationality has a deep time dimension, because the viruses started roughly 12,000 years ago with the settlement of humans, and with then slowly starting to take on domestic animals and so forth. So it's a long-term, it's a really long durée history here, relational history. Or I can also say that with Dipesh Chakraborty's newest book on the Anthropocene, when he says the now of human history, the now of pandemic history is now entangled with the long now of biological and geological timescales. I think we can say something similar about the pandemics and the development of viruses and the co-development of viruses with human history. So what we need to get our heads around is something like a human, non-human co-construction or interaction or symbiosis of pandemics. And of course, I am using the words here of new materialist research, of post-human studies, as it has been advanced by Bennett, Berard, or Donna Haraway. If we bring that back to the field of memory studies, then the interesting thing is that a sense of relationality is really the fundament of the field, because that's exactly what Maurice Halbwachs has said, that remembering, even our most individual remembering, is always a relational thing. It always happens in relation with other people. It's social. And in psychology and psychoanalysis, to this day, there are approaches to therapy that work with relational remembering. How do I build my own memories, for example, together with my mother, when it's about childhood memories? And I think in the so-called third phase or third wave of memory studies, when we saw the transcultural and the transnational term, we have realized that relationality is not just the small social group or the national social group or an in-group, but it's very transcultural and it operates transnationally, collective memory. So there are transnational relations involved. And I think we need to widen this sense of relationality once more towards post-human or non-human perspectives. And I think that's basically what I wanted to say. And now I'm extremely curious to get in a discussion with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Astrid, for such an insightful like presentation. I was listening to you like spellbounded. So now I would like to open the floor for discussion. Any comments or questions that you would like to ask Astrid? You can type the questions or directly ask her.
If you don't ask, I'll ask you. May I?
Sure, but okay.
We'll wait a little bit. People need to.
Sure, but I mean, till the people make up their mind, can I make like one
Absolutely.
comment?
Absolutely.
Because I mean, obviously, I read the article that you sent, and I was also thinking because I have worked on Benjamin's palimpsestic memory. So I was wondering, like, how memory acts as a palimpsest, because like I mean, for a certain period of time, the memory of Spanish flu wasn't that evident in people's mind or the citizens' mind, but like later we can see they are like remembering and the traumatic experiences. So can we say that memory actually acts as palimpsest, or like what do you like to comment on that?
Yeah, thanks so much. I think that's an extremely important question about the metaphors of memory that we have, because now we can think about memory basically only in metaphors, and the question is which ones do we use? And I think the palimpsest is a good metaphor, and it makes a lot of sense also in the sense of that you have manuscripts where older strata shine through. So I think it's a good and it's a much used metaphor. I don't use it too much because the palimpsest for me is still a bit static. For me, the reoccurrence of Spanish flu memory has a lot to do with people running around talking to each other, media culture coming in there. So I don't know how to project this more complex idea and dynamic idea on something that is still relatively static, although it gives us the idea that things may shine through older strata. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I can see one question in the comment box, chat box, but just one more point from my side, and then I'll shut up. So recently I was part of a project on COVID response, like the response of Indian government on the expats. And obviously my project was mainly based on the data that I could get from the internet, because I couldn't be like personally be in the country and see. So as you were mentioning that even when we see the response towards expat, if we like consider expat as a whole group, but even the response of the Indian government was kind of different based on their social class, because as I was working on my project, so I could see there were like several special transport system introduced by the government to bring back the expats who were like stuck outside. So in certain cases, people who are belonging comparatively to the lower strata, they were not well informed, or they did not have the smartphones to like access or purchase the tickets or something. So you are very right that there was a distinction based on class, and I wouldn't say caste because I couldn't see that in the expat group, but yeah, definitely on the basis of class.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. Yeah, I see your point. And I'm not sure whether our government made distinction, but that class still plays such a huge role, has become clear like through a magnifying glass in the pandemic. And we also see that there are still people who are uninformed. They come with corona into the hospital and they have not heard so far of what has been happening. And this has to do with class. It has to do with multicultural societies where you need to translate information and so on, which doesn't always happen here. Yeah.
So like while I was working, I asked myself, like I kept on wondering, like even a pandemic couldn't like get through this, like get over this class distinction. So even a pandemic couldn't do that, it seems. Okay, now I take the question from the chat box. It's from Bhavya. She's asking that does pandemic memory has the potential to turn into a Proustian memory, given the fact that there were several instances where COVID-19 pandemic has been successfully related to the climate change. Some experts even believe that the next decade will bring forth the global scenario of huge climate change in the form of a huge pandemic.
Let me quickly.
Yeah, sure, please do.
Yeah, reread. I have an answer and a question. For me personally, COVID-19 and climate change are related, either on the historical and factual base that we go forth and forth into wildlife and thus make pandemics more and more possible or more easy to happen. So it has that. And on the other hand, that's something like I don't know, a structural or pragmatic thing. We learn now how it is when our extreme entire world breaks down, and we learn how it is when we need to acquire new habits. And I think that's extremely important as knowledge and capacities for addressing what we will face with climate change very soon. That's for me personally the connection. And then the Proustian memory, I don't understand. I'll have to ask back Bhavya, what do you mean with Proustian memory here? Because I'm thinking now of the mémoire involontaire, but you're probably thinking of something else.
Bhavya, would you like to join the discussion, please?
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah,
Hi,
you are.
yes.
Hi, that was actually a very great lecture. Actually, by Proustian memory, I meant that a sudden involuntary memory response to the situation. For example, if you're let's say that if you're dealing with the climate change pandemic in the next decade, then is there a chance that we would connect that pandemic with the present pandemic that is happening right now, like some kind of an involuntary response to it, or some sort of an involuntary decision making technique or anything like that?
I could well imagine that. I could well imagine that. And the face masks, because they are such a habit memory, that's also how to put them on. That's now in my body. It wasn't 1 year ago. I had great difficulties of putting it on. And a pandemic in 5 or 10 years time, I think we are all very quick in groping for those face masks or having similar reactions. Or involuntary memory, of course, Proust meant bringing him back to his earlier life. That could well be that, and that would be, well, psychologists would call that a state-dependent retrieval. No, similar state, and then you retrieve easier.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much. So
Shrimoyee, can I say something?
Sure, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the lecture. Found it really, really interested. Good connect on so many levels. And while you were talking about that, a lot of people started archiving, the COVID-19 very early. I think we were one of those group which started very early. Delhi Comparatives started archiving the COVID-19 early responses in India. So speaking of that, I was working on COVID-19 and Muslim community in India. So we were very eager to record the initial early responses, because we were worried that if we will delay too much later, the response will eventually change and all that. And while you also said that how the COVID-19 will be remembered, so I was thinking about these community specific experience in India of COVID-19, because I think it will be based on the experience the person had of COVID-19, and that's how it will be remembered. Because for a Muslim, the experience will be of communalization, and by that I don't mean all the Muslims, right? So for migrant workers, the experience would be very different of the pandemic. So will be the memory of it, right? So like you mentioned, that class plays a very important role there. So there are many, India being a very diverse country, brings a lot of such different experience, and I think that it will be recalled in the similar manner, very, very differently with each other. Coming to some of the early responses, which you were eager to know that how people were starting to rationalize or started thinking about this pandemic. Then that I would like to talk to you about was earlier, initially people, and this is based on some of the interviews that we have done, extensive surveys that we have done. People were actually not thinking that this virus will actually have this much of intensity and scale, and they thought that it will pass just like other virus, Ebola, SARS, and all that. But when because Italy has already been, the worsening news were coming from Italy, people were scared. But initially there were a lot of conspiracy theories, which you have also mentioned, like China conspiracy motivated by trade wars, and a hoax also created by medical companies. But India being a deeply religious society, I think also plays a very crucial role in offering explanations to believers from different community. And again, coming back to Muslims, Muslim community, where I saw that obviously the educated ones, who are well informed, started to go for the scientific explanations of the pandemic. There was a whole set of people, very religious minded, found explanation in their scriptures, about the possibility of pandemic, because it has come in times of different prophets and Khalifa, and they were very contented about it. Yeah, it's a pandemic, it has happened before. So I think that memory kept them alive, and since it also gave them advices for taking precautions, because Prophet Muhammad advised people to not to go where epidemic or pandemic has spread. So it also offered them precautionary, so they accepted it. So I think I have to mute because there is azan at my place. So I think I would love to hear your response to that.
Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting for me. So yeah, thanks. That's wonderful. I can only say that all this is extremely interesting. When you say personal experience, yes, I also feel even here, small country, people very much the same, no? Not so big social differences. It is a hyper diversification. If you have a bakery, you are fine. If you have a cafe, you are probably bankrupt, just because of what the regulations were. So that's really interesting, because it means that we cannot conceive of the pandemic in simple regional or national frames, because that's something what we sometimes do, of course, when remembering or making sense of events. That interviewees said that they think it will pass. Yes, Germans or Europeans thought so too, but Indians obviously with Ebola and SARS had at least some precedents that did pass. Religious dimension I find interesting, because with the medieval plague, what Christians thought is that it is a punishment by God, but I would have to read up, and I don't know whether perhaps there is more in the Bible, in the older scriptures, about also best practice models of what to do when the pandemic strikes. And when it comes to your archiving and interviewing, I was interested in the multilinguality of it. In what languages would you conduct this?
For Muslim community, actually there's azan at my place. I'll just type it in the chat box, okay?
For sure. I'll read that.
Zerka, I can add to that. Yeah, I can answer for Zerka on this.
Super.
Please
Yeah.
do.
Actually, we conducted, first of all, for Muslim community in India, Urdu plays more or less as a lingua franca. But the moment you go to places where you are going to the mass, you need various different languages. So the whole project was like this. Zerka covered middle India, we can say, northern India, Uttar Pradesh and Delhi. And then other scholars covered other areas. So a Kashmiri scholar covered Kashmir, a Bengali scholar covered Bengal, like that. So we had specific scholars working in the specific zones. For northern India, Hindi and Urdu worked because, those who don't know Urdu can also at times converse, at least communicate. And of course, for Zerka, it was much more easier. And also for the pan-India, we had to adopt English. We also surveyed a sort of pan-Indian response. There we had to adopt English, which of course limited our exposure to the recipients or the audience to a sort of middle class, not upper, but lower middle class, from lower middle class. So this is how we try to tackle the multilinguality of India.
Very good. And if you have published anything on that already, then I'd be very interested in having the references.
The reports have already been up because this was a project which, actually, this is a multi-phase project. So one was the Muslim response or Muslim community and COVID-19 in India, because that was sponsored by Tokyo University of Foreign Studies. It is on their website, the reports, not the papers, but the reports. So I can send the link to Shrimoyee and she will forward that to you. And now we are working on a larger space, COVID-19 cultural responses in India. So we had quite a few, we already are in the reviewing process. So I think by the end of this year, we'll come up with a book on that, where we are covering a lot of other issues like Sikh responses. Some are community-based, Sikh, Buddhist, etc. Then ancestor worshippers. And of course, then there are like class-based, middle class, students, women, Dalit. And of course, also there are the shift that has happened in the art and expression. Because I was just trying to intervene, but first thing, when you were talking about the memory and the models that you have used, I was curious. I'm adding my question here itself. All earlier pandemics saw us getting out of social contact. This time we also experienced it, but this time was with a big difference. We are in touch with each other through online, at least up the lower middle class. I assume that you will need a newer model to understand how this time memory is constructed and gets passed on to other generations. Just a hunch, I'm not a memory studies student. So this is what we have found, because one of the most important aspects that came in our study, we are still processing the material, is the change that has happened in our understanding of private and public.
Yeah.
Thanks to the online thing.
Yeah.
And I think this will have a longer, I will ask memory study scholars to develop newer models to deal with that. So what I'll do is that through Shrimoyee, I'll send you a detail about our projects.
That would be super interesting. Thank you so much. And
Thanks.
yeah, the digital component with everything, the private and public, and a greater, for Germany, I can say much greater digitalization, where we were really very, I don't know, back. These are all very fascinating aspects. At the same time, I spoke to a psychologist for children and youth recently, and of course they all could use social media and they did stay in touch, and yet at the same time their offices are full with children and youth seeking advice. So there seems to be something in the group face-to-face interaction that kids need, and that wasn't there. Yeah. Can I ask you something about, oh yeah.
Yeah, to the kids only, I'll add, for example, last night, my nephew at around 10 got a call from one of his friends that they are 6 years old. So his friend couldn't go to sleep without talking. And they had a class. I mean, I can see the kids are really suffering because they are in touch, they are talking, but they need that physicality that is involved when they go to a school or a playground. I think this will become an important thing.
Yeah, I imagine that's the case, and I'll wait for the social scientists to come up with their research on that. Yeah, I was wondering about commemorative culture. Did you have these anniversary commemorations of the dead as well? Are there grassroots commemorative events? Is that something that plays a role?
I have not seen anything like that, but let me search. Oh, that's a very interesting. I mean, what happened when the first case happened? Apart from newspapers, but okay, first lockdown maybe. I'll look into it. I have not looked into it, but it was not very prominent. Otherwise, we would have seen that. But so there might be one or two examples.
That is probably the sense is we're still in the midst of it. You cannot even.
Yeah, that's.
I want to add one thing here, I remember lockdown anniversary because lockdown was such a trauma for migrants, that I remember that when the lockdown was announced, there was something called lockdown anniversary, and it was in the newspaper, and those images of migrants coming back to their native places. So since again and again, I'm emphasizing the experience depends on how the experience of the pandemic was from different people, and India being very diverse will bring a lot of multiple responses to that.
Yeah. Hang on, let me just say hi to my kids who have just come home. Hi. So, yeah. And that's the interesting thing. Even countries that are less diverse than India, like Germany, have the hyper-diversity in the experience of the pandemic. And at the same time, we have, I don't know what other event would have had that as implication. We are all in the same boat globally. And I think that makes an interesting constellation. Yeah.
Yes, and also when I was going through I was looking at the slides and I was remembering those things. I'll go back to the point that I was earlier mentioning. I'll just expand on that. The production, cultural productions actually encase memory and also help in remembering. Now, this is the first time we are having simultaneous productions. When the pandemic is happening, we are having those representations and productions. I think this is also going to change how we earlier understood or remembered, and re-enshrined our pandemic experiences.
Yeah, and when it comes to cultural productions, I've taught a seminar, a course this summer for my students on mediating pandemics, and they came up in their own projects with quite a corpus of comics and graphic novels. That seems to be a major medium, and then also of poems. That also another, of course, it's a quick medium, and then to the point, poetry is important. And of course, they didn't find any movies or many documentaries yet, long forms, difficult. What I find surprising is that in Germany, there is already 1 or 2 novels about the pandemic, which for me is surprising because similar events, it often took 10 years, 20 years before the novel about whatever had come out. So that's, yeah.
Yeah, in Bengali, yesterday only I got a collection of poems. Yeah, people are publishing already, but yeah, novel, okay, I have not seen either. Right,
Yeah.
right. So I think all of these will change how we understand memory also. I mean, at least how we understand remembering based on the earlier pandemics. Thanks a lot.
Absolutely, thank you. Yeah.
So any further questions or comments for Astrid? If you want to type or directly ask her.
So Shrimoyee, if there is no other question, then I think you can wrap up.
Okay. So thank you once again, Astrid, for accepting our invitation for such a beautiful presentation. And thanks to the participants for continuing the discussion in such a great manner. So thank you. And I would like to end the event officially now.
Thank you so much. It was great talking to you, and Sarka, with you, at least I saw and heard a little bit of India background, so that was good. All right, then
Thank you.
Hear from you soon, I hope, at least the references.
Thanks a lot.
Sure,
I'm
sure.
Amitava. I'm supposedly the convener, I mean, of the group, DC. I was supposed to come late and talk to thank you, but I must say one thing, I must tell you one thing, you know, your lecture has also helped us in a way, because we are in the process of reviewing the material, and we are primarily trying to grasp the multi-layered society and its responses. This model also, I think, would become a very important thing when we want to put together and write the introduction, sit down to write the introduction. This will be very helpful, and I'm sure quite a few of today's listeners are actually part of this project. They have done field work. I don't know why not many of them have asked you questions or have added their comments. I think for this whole group, your lecture was very important, very relevant. It will help us to rethink. And we might, particularly I'll of course, when I sit and write the introduction, I'll of course try to contact you if I have to understand a few other points, maybe a few references in the comparative zone.
Please do. I find your comparative group really, really interesting, and it would be great to stay in touch also with what we do in Frankfurt. I think that resonates a lot. So that leaves me just to say thanks, Shri, for bringing us together.
Yeah,
thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.